Decolonization requires acknowledging that your needs and desires should never come at the expense of another's life energy. It is being honest that you have been spoiled by a machine that is not feeding you freedom, but feeding you the milk of pain. The release. Hi, welcome to Season 3 of the Prana and Poetry Pod. This is Episode 1, Dharma and Decoloniality. When you're practicing or teaching Indigenous cultural knowledge traditions, whether you are from that culture or not, when that culture has been colonized, it is a personal responsibility to cultivate a foundation of decoloniality, especially if you're positioning yourself as a teacher, coach, or healer of that practice. The colonial mind and body seeks to have ownership and control over Indigenous people and their wisdom traditions and sciences, often through violence, which can take many forms, from physical, meaning holding power over their bodies and their land, to psychological and epistemological, the last of which is particularly threatening, as not only do the colonizers seek control over Indigenous knowledge, but they superimpose their own ideologies and belief systems over native understandings for the purpose of culturally erasing knowledge that empowers and heals its own community. This is done both consciously and unconsciously. In doing so, over time, they disconnect the native person from their ancestral identity and wisdoms, bringing them into the fold of coloniality, where one is forced to live either as a machine, in survival with no rest, or as a ghost, disembodied from the world around them, including the relationship with their own soul and being, the relationship with their true needs and desires and life purpose. In a colonial system, we're forced to seek permission to use our voice and be visible, trained over centuries to obey an authority that exists outside of the self, especially if we don't belong to the dominant culture, which holds a privileged worldview. A world designed to meet the master culture's needs at the sacrifice of our ancestral land, its knowledge systems, and body sovereignty. Even today, there are bodies of culture, or bipoc, who sacrifice their consciousness and truth to fit into the status quo, who code switch and sacrifice their cultural identities to find a place within the dominant systems to belong, often having to mimic the dominant culture. If we're talking about the West, even having the pressure to mimic white bodies, again, if we're talking specifically about white supremacy culture. And we can see this happening in the yoga industry, the pressure to look like a white-bodied gymnast, to even be hired within elite yoga studios or anywhere where yoga is taught. Our difference, racially and ethnically, is threatening, so we have to play small, hide our true voice and needs. This is a practice of self-betrayal, and it kills the soul. I've grown up in a culture that is Indian and Hindu at home, and white and Western outside of the home, in a racist system that mocked and ridiculed my culture, my language, the food, and our visible traditional practices. For example, wearing a bindi or donning a sari, using a tongue scraper, eating with our hands, mocked for our native practices that actually come from Ayurveda and yoga. And would you know these things are cool now? But only if they come from white bodies or white passing bodies. The avidya maya is for real. There is so much sacred rage and anger that comes from the process of uncolonizing, that comes from unlearning the lies of history as propagated to us by colonial education systems. So much re-wounding in relearning the truth from our own perspectives, the Indigenous lens. Remembering again the stories of violence and abuse in our land of origin from our grandparents, and knowing now that what we were and are put through within education, or rather indoctrination, is actually gaslighting. I'm glad there are names for these colonial tactics. The grief and anger comes from seeing outsiders of the culture now taking what they like from our culture, like from a pick-and-mix sweet shop, only now they figured out that our, quote, sweets not only taste delicious, their innate makeup or chemistry holds a deep science behind it. For a price, they can take what they like in a free market. Call the sweets whatever name they like, rebrand them even, claim that they made it better, regardless of its cultural sacredness and integrity. They bullied us for being Indian and Hindu, or insert your cultural identity here. But now, yoga, for example, is cool, as long as it doesn't come from an Indian and Hindu body. Now that the, quote, sweet shop owner conforms to the ideals of the dominant group, the source of the product and its corrupted chemistry is disregarded. It's okay to take, so long as the profit of the so-called sweets or candy go into one's own pocket and back into the hegemonic system. Who loses out in this scenario? Who is left out? Whose voice is silenced? Do you see how power is gatekept? Do you see who gets to shape certain narratives? Do you see how supremacy culture gets away with theft and ethnocide? This, my friend, is called colonialism and narcissism. Please see Season 1 of my podcast series and Episode 3 titled Narcissism and Colonialism, the Same Demon. Do you know the history of the land or the indigenous practices you use for your services from the view of the indigenous people? Or are you getting your information from those invested in keeping the land and its people disempowered? Let's use yoga or yoga, the correct pronunciation, as an example. Are you getting knowledge from inside the culture and learning from the indigenous teaching methodology, which has safeguards in place and ensures the student practitioner is protected from harm? Or are you learning from non-indigenous and colonized academics, Western Indologists who are often critics of the culture and have political and other hidden agendas to the information they share about the culture they are obsessed with, or let's be real, that they pathologically envy? Notice I said information here. There is a difference between knowledge, which in the indigenous traditions is transformational and embodied, whereas information is that which comes from, let's say, Western yoga teacher trainings and Western academic textbooks, which are commodified forms of information used for a transactional purpose. It's devised to serve the capitalist market, it is a commodity, and it is disembodied and disconnected from the lived culture and communities that carry these traditions forward. In the case of Sanatan Dharma or Sanatana Dharma, pronounced in Sanskrit, yoga's origin and framework, the Hindu lineages, which we call our sampradayas. This is why putting words in front of yoga like trauma-informed or embodied yoga is a complete farce. It's dishonest and false, because these are ideas that are severed from yoga's context and root and serves only a specific kind of audience. There is no reflection or mention of the trauma of the people who have carried these indigenous wisdoms forward through their cultural memory and body. How can you talk of trauma-informed yoga as if, number one, this concept is a Western invention which has somehow improved the original teachings, when yoga is in fact trauma-informed and embodied when taught correctly within its indigenous teaching methodology, which Westerners don't often seek out? And number two, be so tone-deaf to not even bring into the discussion the trauma of the people from the Indian subcontinent. Can you really not see beyond the filter of whiteness or white centering? So who is your yoga for? What of the yamas and the niyamas? Where is the ethical consciousness? And if you have an issue with terms like whiteness, white fragility, and all those terms that come from critical race theory, then this space is not for you. Clearly, there is no cultural and ideological awareness. We are not on the same page, and I banish ignorant and irresponsible energy from my channels. I'm done with arguing. There is no debating Indigenous voices, identity, and sovereignty. I'm not here to debate. I'm here to teach and guide. And I'm here for like-minded, sensitive soul warriors who are aware of the moral and ethical responsibility of handling knowledge from Indigenous cultures with a good sense of care and especially with humility, a concept lost in Western wellness spaces. Because what I've experienced all my life is the entitlement and ego and complete lack of awareness of those taking from Indigenous cultures what they like with no responsibility to its living culture and local communities. Decolonization is an act of reverence. It is an act of justice. To view it as a theory is no good. It is a practice of doing the right thing, which, would you know, is one of the meanings of Dharma, duty, upholding righteousness. And please don't fill the word righteousness with religious ideology that is foreign to Indigenous cultures. It does not belong here, especially in Hindu cosmology and ecology. Take away that biased lens. So let's move to the lens of decolonization. Who is teaching you? What is the source of your knowledge? And is there a direct connection to the living community of that culture? Do any of your friends come from that culture? Have you asked them for the correct pronunciation of borrowed words, for example? It's not for them to teach you, it's for you to humbly ask. Can you see how the centering of the dominant ideology onto Indigenous ways of life is so harmful? Taking responsibility in how we use Indigenous practices is important because you don't know what may harm someone who actually belongs to that culture by saying something or doing something misinformed in your class or personal sessions. Diluted knowledge that belongs to a complete and holistic system can harm anyone. This applies to all of us who are colonized, regardless of background. Even those from the Indian subcontinent can and often are teaching from misinformed places, teaching colonized histories and realities taught to them by their oppressors, simply because they refuse to listen to those who have protected Indigenous knowledge systems through lineage like that of the Guru Shishya Parampara. The invaders could not defeat this great oral tradition of the Hindu people. It is why our ancient Sanatan Dharma and Vedic knowledge has survived the tests of time for you to now enjoy, despite so much violence towards us and cultural erasure through the centuries. Our ancestors protected this knowledge, so, as a Hindu, I do feel a moral responsibility to uphold Dharma and protect our sacred traditions from continued harm so that it can be passed on to future generations without distortion and in its wholeness. When Westerners say yoga is India's gift to the world, may I question who gifted it? Who? What is their cultural identity? Why do you distance yourself from the Hindus or Sanatanis that gifted you yoga? Sanatan Dharma is the framework of the rishis, the seers who received the Vedas in meditation. Hindus are the living culture of these scriptures. What are you afraid of, really? Are you afraid of the truth? Satyame vijayate. The truth will always prevail, so you might as well start aligning with it. For a while, I was also of the mind of, yoga's political, during the very important Black Lives Matters movement, where BIPOC communities suddenly had courage to speak our truths, especially the truth of systemic oppression. But like many, I confused decolonization with social justice work, which, if imposed on yoga, becomes another neo-colonial project. And now, social justice language is being weaponized to cause anti-Indian and anti-Hindu hate. The same colonial patterns of behaviour are repeating themselves in another garb, just to alienate the Indigenous voice. Of course, yoga is not political. It is spiritual. It is a spiritual discipline from Sanatana Dharma. This is its context and root. If social justice work is part of one's dharma, then that's a different story. But to impose a foreign ideology onto yoga, that's just continued colonization. I've had to humble myself, not join in on particular yoga trends to remain relevant in the capitalist market. I choose to align with Dharma. Dharma and decoloniality are my values. Know your unconscious and conscious biases. What do you know about your own ancestry and conditionings? How is that imprinting on the Indigenous cultural practice that you're using for your own growth and development, or that you're using as a tool or resource for teaching? What outsiders see as tools, something that can be split from and taken from the whole, are sacred containers, ways of seeing, and embodiment and medicine for insiders. Yoga is therefore not a philosophy, which is a mental game. It is a darshana. If this concept is not taught in your trainings, then what the actual fuck? Remember, I'm operating from sacred rage and anger, talking about this stuff. My journey is currently how to remain true to Dharma whilst I engage with decoloniality. This is a grief journey for me and others like me, not a trend, not a viewpoint. It is a lived experience. It is pain. Because in looking at the wound, analysing it, speaking about it, it's like continually picking at it, and that fucking hurts. Questions to ask when using aspects of someone else's culture for profit and before sharing information or knowledge for guiding others. Where am I disembodied? What am I not hearing? Where am I being shadowed? Am I taking cultural knowledge from a place of reverence to its source and context? Or am I coming from a place of criticism, entitlement, and ego, ignoring the voices of its living communities? Decoloniality is coming from the view of honesty and integrity towards the cultural source and the reality of that culture now. It's coming from the place of understanding our own conditioning and biases. It's holding compassion. It's filling the empathy gap that comes from supremacist conditionings and which is located in the physical body and can be repaired through inner somatic work. It's being humble, that you don't know everything, that it may not even be your place to know. Let that settle in. Is it your place to know? Is it your place to take? Even though yoga is part of my cultural heritage, I too had to ask myself these questions when I was longing for authentic yogic knowledge, when I was longing to learn from Indigenous and lineage teachers. There are some cultures whose practices are strictly closed, and for the right reasons, like cultural genocide. Yet colonized folks still complain about gatekeeping, whilst being oblivious to the history of dehumanization and genocide, which is the story of all Indigenous cultures, including my own Hindu way of life, known to us as Sanatana Dharma. Dharma is the fabric of a Hindu's reality. We have practices of initiation and a concept called adhikari. A person must have the competence and right attitude to practice and receive transformational knowledge, meaning that one must qualify in order to receive it, let alone teach it. Why? Because knowledge and power in the wrong hands corrupts and leads a person away from Dharma. And this is what has played out in reality. Hello, Western wellness industry. This is why we are in what Hindus know as the Dark Age, the Kali Yuga. To think you should be free to have access to Indigenous practices is a byproduct of the colonial and imperialist mind, which is a fragmented entity, one that comes from the position of complete disembodiment, entitlement. It's a colonizer mentality. In the Dharmic traditions, humility is an essential quality. How can you receive embodied teachings when the ego concerns itself only with what it can take, without consideration if it is even qualified to take it? The yoga industry is really messed up right now, and we can keep moving in the direction of entitlement, distortion, dilution, misinformation, which comes from sources and voices from outside of the culture. Or we can start listening to Indigenous voices and stay rooted to its source and pay attention to its cultural context and the living communities from which it derives. How are you uncolonizing your knowledge, yourself, your body, and perhaps even your business? Can you be who you are and where you are right now in your process, and yet still show up with integrity and honesty in sharing cultural teachings that come from the cultural bodies that have been violated and abused, like the bodies descending from Sanatana Dharma, who have been traumatized and violated for over 1,000 years, both in the land body, Bharat Bhumi, and the physical body? I invite you to hold that question as you continue to stay true to your needs, as you continue to practice and teach from a place of humility and respect towards that which nourishes and sustains you. Yoga has given you so much. That's what I hear, even from its one limb of asana practice, the postures. Are you willing to give back? I'm really speaking to those who already take self-responsibility, those who are here to make a big change, an impact, those who wish to nurture their inner light and follow their unique nature and purpose, those who wish to do right, are morally and ethically conscious, which is another way of saying those who are dharmic, those who wish to uphold the goodness in the world. This means you already do your inner work on race and supremacist ideologies, you understand anti-racism, and you understand the meanings and importance of decolonization and decolonial healing. Everyone needs to uncolonize body, mind, heart, and spirit, but especially those of us who receive a calling in this life to heal the disconnection with the self and body, and those wishing to support growth, transformation, and healing within other bodies. You have a big vision and a mission, and you're here to fulfill it. Rather than going into the shadow, can you stay conscious for a moment and just listen without the need to get defensive? Can you feel the inner victim rise up and the need to debate that which is past its sell-by date to debate? I'm committing to surrounding myself with those on the decolonial path of self-growth and healing and transformation. This means there is a culture of compassion, care, listening, understanding, a culture of support and care for one another's community and the oppression that each of our lineages have faced and continues to face. Decolonization is a value I hold. I've corrected mistakes I've made myself in the past using other Indigenous cultural practices, having had incorrect knowledge, which I received from non-Indigenous sources, I might add. So this is a journey of unlearning and undoing harm and learning from teachers or lineaged teachings, whoever it comes from, but knowing that this knowledge is embodied and time-tested. I don't want to be here to just talk about it, let's put it into action. It's action that matters, and it's action that provides change. I recently had heated exchanges from a couple of clearly ideologically oppressed men over a topic that only the Indigenous should concern themselves with. In other words, it was none of their business. And this arguing with those speaking from privilege and entitlement just fucking wasted my time and wiped me out energetically. This depriving of energy and power is the aim or goal of colonizers after all. I don't owe colonized and ignorant folks my time. I don't owe labor, and these are not the people I'm serving. I'm here for change makers, big picture thinkers, and so that waste of time was a huge lesson for me to stay embodied in my own knowing and from my own safe boundaries. Boundaries that are provided within the framework of Sanatana Dharma, which To reduce its definition is to mean staying in alignment with nature's laws, rhythms, and cycles, including my body's innate wisdoms. It was a huge lesson to stay focused on my own cultural medicine and purpose. And understand that I know we are all colonized, and to uncolonize body, mind, heart, and spirit is the work. It's what I've been teaching for several years, but never having used these terms that describes this work so apparently and consistently until the last couple of years. Decoloniality feels right for now. Every client that has come to me and who I've taught in my programs have this one root issue. Every obstacle and struggle they have is rooted in one challenge and one alone. That is relationship trauma. This was also my story. Everyone wants a healthy relationship, and what I teach is the repairing of the relationship with the self first, tending to one's innate wholeness, before shifting to the obvious desire for healthy relationships or friendships and connections. Where do toxic relationships and people come from in the first place? Is it something first starting within the self and body, and the world just mirroring back to you this disconnection, this wound? What is the root cause of toxic behaviours and misalignment with self and nature, and all of that which goes against the fabric of reality, understood by Indigenous Hindus as Dharma? And so we come back to the importance of creating a foundation of decoloniality in daily life, relationships, and business, and the sacred journey of uncolonizing body, mind, heart, and spirit, so that we can create and live our visions from an authentic, aware, and a more mentally and emotionally integrated place. A place of thriving that doesn't require self-sacrifice or sacrificing the needs and freedoms of Indigenous cultures, specifically their voices. I'll close with questions inspired by Nayira Wahid's poetic words that I opened this podcast with. Can we seek and establish ourselves from a place that doesn't come at the expense of another's life energy? Can we nourish ourselves not from the milk of another's pain, but from a wholeness that only our authentic and honest connection to ourselves, to each other, and nature can provide? Let's move towards more consciousness and doing the least harm by listening to Indigenous voices and putting decoloniality into practice. Let us connect back to our ancestral wisdom traditions, heal our relationship with ourselves at the root and with others, so that we can create a life with meaningful relationships and a business with integrity that is in line with our purposeful missions. Let us experience a safe and loving world. Rise up, warrior. Hey, it's Bile. I've got a resource for you. It's my Decolonial Toolkit. Not only does it combine a content bank of relevant past articles and podcasts, I offer you a list of books to support your process of uncolonizing. I've done the hard work of gathering this important list of books from Indigenous and decolonial perspectives to help you decolonize Bharat's history, decolonize Sanskrit and the Vedas, and understand other important concepts within this category. I've also left you a surprise gift to help you get started. Download it now.